Hey, I'm not going to make this one too long, and it's going to be in a similar vein to a previous video I made, but I want to say something. Today's news, I should say, the news in the last 24 hours, has really exemplified why the migrant crisis is the humanitarian disaster crisis of our time. Um, it's been particularly prominent this year for all the wrong reasons. There was news earlier today yesterday, I should say, that 50 people were found smothered in a truck on a motorway in Austria. Um, I'm not sure which country they came from, but they have been trafficked by people smugglers. 50 people. It reminds me of something that happened in Britain and Dover in the year 2000. A similar situation. People had been trafficked from China. 50 people. Um, it seems more likely these people would be from the Middle East or the Horn of Africa, but that's one incident, and then in another case, yet another overcrowded ferry has sunk in the Mediterranean. In fact, several hundreds are feared drowned. This is now happening so regularly that it's barely even news anymore in itself. Had this been a cruise liner that had sunk, it would have been absolutely headlines for days. But hey, it's just migrants, so their lives are not that important. That's pretty much the path that we're going down, that we are becoming desensitized. Each and every one of these people is a man, woman, or child. They're human beings who have their own personalities, their own fears, their own desires, etc. Um, I want to make this video specifically, though, to direct this at Britain's tabloid editors. I've made no secret of the fact I have utter contempt for our tabloids. So this is really a video for, not that they're going to be watching it, but a video for David Dinsmore, Hugh Whittow, and Paul Dacre. They're the editors of Britain's three biggest tabloids, which is respectively, the Sun, the Daily Express, and the Daily Mail. Now, all three of those newspapers have been guilty of using very irresponsible language in regards to this issue. The Daily Mail, for example, has been scaremongering over the supposed numbers that are coming into Britain, refusing to give any sort of proportion to the fact that there's far more migrants going to Germany and Turkey than there are to Britain. We're taking a fraction of the overall numbers. Um, the Daily Express is just beyond trash. In my opinion, it's a far right publication. I believe it has far right sympathies, and its reporting is just beyond the pale. And the Sun is kind of sees itself as a more fun version of the Daily Express. But basically, in my opinion, all three are nasty rags, and they're not being honest about this at all. Um, and I just think it's shameful that these men, whilst they're enjoying a massive salary, whilst they're enjoying the comfortable life that they have, whilst they're hiding behind their editorial desk, because unlike politicians, they don't have to face the cameras. Um, they're just pumping out, I'm not going to say lies, but outright distortions about what is going on here. And what they're doing is they're creating resentment amongst their readership. You just look at a Daily Mail forum and see the sort of spiteful, nasty comments from the average Daily Mail reader. I'm not going to say everyone. Occasionally you'll get a compassionate statement, but very often, and it's the same with Daily Express comments and so on, Sun comments, it's comments like, "Oh, we should ship them all back," and too many illegals coming here, this sort of thing. The country's being swamped by these people. Um, I think it's utterly reprehensible. I mean, a lot of people who read these papers, and I'm not going to be particularly diplomatic here, but frankly, they're too thick to realize how stupid their comments are. But the men who edit these papers know damn well what they're doing, and in my opinion, that makes them despicable. I don't want to make this a very hateful video because I don't want to detract from the main issue, which is the humanitarian crisis that is going on. The main issue here should be on compassion. So I don't want to sort of make the main focus of my argument contempt for what these guys are doing, but I do have contempt for it. And there's another point I'd like to make, which is that just because someone has taken this sort of stance, i.e., arguing for compassion, does not make them a loony lefty. I'm not calling for unlimited immigration, and I'm not calling for just anybody to be let in. For example, I said in the previous video, those who are threatening lorry drivers, they should be refused entry because they're using physical violence. But you know, the vast majority of migrants are just desperate people trying to flee a desperate situation. Men, women, and children who I mean, I read a report recently from, I believe it was Kos, Greece. Men, women, and children cramped into a stadium. Um, it's just heartbreaking to see what's happening here. Um, and I do think we're becoming desensitized. And you know, I'm not a hippie, I'm not a loony lefty. I'm not calling for unlimited immigration. But I am saying that we need to be a lot more responsible in how we talk about this problem. And that's not being politically correct. It's just about being a decent human being. Because I can see the effect that this reporting is having. Number one, it is misleading people because despite what those rags say, we are not being swamped by Syrian refugees. We have taken a very, very small proportion. Um, the civil war in Syria is the deadliest war of this decade, of the 2010s decade. We've taken a very small fraction. Now, as a stable democracy, we do have a moral obligation to provide. Not only is that stipulated in the UN, but it is the right thing to do. Um, and you know, I'm not. I know that we have our own problems. I know we have homeless problems in Britain. I mean, today, for example, I heard another report that 2,300 people deemed fit to work by the Department of Work and Pensions have died in the period from 2011 to 2014. So, you know, austerity has hurt many Britons as well. And I'm not trivializing the problems that we are facing, but it's very misleading to think that because we are dealing with problems in this country, we don't have the capability to help others. That is just a distortion of the reality. The fact of the matter is we have the ability to do both. If this government wasn't focusing so much on cuts, then they would have the ability to both provide for British people, which is their foremost priority, and also address our humanitarian responsibility in the world. I totally reject this notion that it's one or the other, and unfortunately, the political right has been sending out that impression, aided by the tabloid press, that you know if anyone sort of calls for a humanitarian approach to this, I get frustrated when I see comments like, "Oh, charity begins at home," because I think you know those people are I think sometimes they have good intentions because they have compassion for British people who are suffering, and there are people who are suffering. You know, we have a big homeless problem. We do have people who are suffering, but I still contend that the problems that we have in this country are minuscule in terms of proportion to what is happening in other parts of the world. And I'm not saying it's our fault what's happening in other parts of the world, because you know very often I believe that the responsibility for those problems lies first and foremost with A, warring parties, and B, with corrupt dictatorial governments. But that doesn't mean that you know, we are one of the most stable, powerful countries in the world. We do have an obligation. It's not rocket science. And I just think it's nauseating how much the tabloids distort this. You know, I am not calling for us just to let everyone in. That's not what I'm saying. But I do believe we can let more people in. At the very, very least, we can change the rhetoric that we use about this. I think it's disgusting, quite frankly, that um, the likes of Katie Hopkins are given a platform. I mean, you know, she can still have her free expression without being given that platform. Who is she? She's a nobody, propped up to be a somebody. I think, and the thing is, Katie Hopkins is a despicable human being, but unfortunately, she's just representative of a vocal contingent in this country who are utterly desensitized. Um, and I'm seeing it in the United States as well, which is a much bigger country actually. Um, Maybe some of my American viewers may not like me saying this, but when I see the likes of Donald Trump and other Republican, especially Republican candidates, talking about aliens and dehumanizing migrants to the United States, A, they're forgetting America's history. It's a country built on immigrants. And B, it's just a reckless way to deal with this issue. Now, again, each country is different, and I appreciate that the United States, like any country, has a right to set barometers. And I have followed the situation. I understand, for example, that there's a perception of unfairness for those who have went through the process legally. They've waited for years. They've done all the right things. Um, I understand that there's a perception of unfairness then for those who have done it illegally to be given precedent. But from my understanding, the idea that all those who are illegal are violent criminals, that's misleading. Donald Trump knows it's misleading. And the way he's talking about, I mean, recently, um, a guy was beaten to death on, I believe it was New York City. It may have been somewhere in the Northeast anyway, by two guys who said Donald Trump was right. Now, Trump, instead of just condemning the incident, he said, "Oh, people have passion." Now, what sort of man is this? That he cannot even bring himself to condemn a vicious murder. To me, that says everything about him, and I think it's despicable. And I'm not saying, again, in the American situation, I'm not saying America should just let everyone in, but I believe that developed democratic countries have a moral obligation to this problem. And it's the same situation in Australia with migrants from Southeast Asia. You know, it's not rocket science. If a country is stable, democratic, and prosperous, it has a moral obligation to help. That doesn't mean just unlimited immigration. It doesn't mean being reckless, i.e., having no controls, which is absolutely not what I'm advocating. But I am saying that such countries have a moral obligation. Incidentally, there's some Asian countries I feel could be pulling the weight a little bit more. I mean, Japan, for example, is a wealthy country. I believe they should be taking more immigrants than what they are from Southeast Asia, from North Korea. Um, I believe every developed country has a moral responsibility in this regard. China, in fact, okay, China's not a democracy, but it's relatively politically stable. And given the size of China, they take a very minuscule fraction of refugees. In fact, what they do is they send refugees back to North Korea, which I think is a disgrace. Um, and you know, people say, "Oh, but China is a huge population." Yes, overall it does, but it is actually a stable population. And if we're talking in terms of density, it's not actually that densely populated compared to some parts of the world. So, you know, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. In the case of Britain, we are a densely populated country. That's why I'm saying that I'm not talking for a massive amount of migrants, but we should be helping the most desperate people. And yes, it can be done through a pragmatic channel. You know, let them go through the process, check their background, um, and you know, make sure they're going to abide by our laws and our culture and so on. But for goodness sake, this is a humanitarian crisis, and I think it's just heartbreaking what we're seeing, and it's nothing to do with being loony lefty. By advocating this, it just makes me so angry that people can be so desensitized. People who have never experienced this in their life, who have the comfort of living in countries like the UK, and yet have such spite and callousness towards these people. It's very sad.